Iran just killed someone in Kuwait. The ceasefire is not broken, it is being weaponized. And I have seen this exact move before. The Iran war just entered its most dangerous phase. And the next 72 hours will determine whether the world steps back or falls forward. Because this is not just another exchange of fire. This is not just another headline from the Gulf. This is what happens when both sides continue talking in public while fighting for leverage in private. Iran struck Kuwait. The United States struck Qeshm Island, pronounced Qeshm Island. And suddenly, the question is no longer whether a ceasefire exists. The question is what the ceasefire is being used for. That is where the story begins, not with the explosion, with the timing. Because Iran did not strike at a random moment. It struck when the talks were supposed to be moving. It struck when Washington was trying to show progress. It struck when the world was being told that Hormuz might reopen, sanctions might be discussed, and the crisis might finally begin to cool. That timing is the message. I have been tracking this conflict across wire services, parliamentary briefings, energy reports, Gulf security updates, and the strategic channels that dominate this space. And what I am about to show you is not the version being packaged for the nightly news. The nightly news will tell you this is a violation. It is. They will tell you it is an escalation. It is. They will tell you it risks restarting the war. It does. But that is still not the full meaning. The full meaning is colder. Iran is using violence to negotiate the terms of calm. And the United States is using force to define the price of reopening Hormuz. This is not peace collapsing. This is bargaining through fire. That is why the next 72 hours matter. Not because the whole conflict ends in 72 hours. It will not. But because the next move tells us what kind of conflict this is becoming. A path back to controlled escalation. Or the first step back into open war. The official story begins with Kuwait. Reuters reported that Iranian missiles and drones targeted Kuwait, damaging Kuwait International Airport and killing one person. Kuwait briefly shut parts of its air operation. Flights were disrupted. Regional air defenses went active. Bahrain was also drawn into the exchange, with Iranian media claiming attacks connected to the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters. Then the United States responded. U.S. forces struck targets on Qeshm Island. That is not just any island. Qeshm sits in the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, pronounced Hormuz. It is not symbolic geography, it is operational geography. It is the place where shipping, surveillance, missiles, drones, naval pressure, and oil anxiety all meet. So when Washington strikes Qeshm, it is not only saying, we can hit Iran. It is saying, we can hit the machinery around Hormuz. And when Iran strikes Kuwait, it is not only saying, we can retaliate. It is saying, your partners are exposed, your bases are exposed, your ceasefire has a price. That is the exchange, not missile for missile, message for message. Before I get to what that means for every household in Britain, I want you to hold one number in your mind. I will come back to it. 500. Hold that number, because this story reaches further than Kuwait, further than Bahrain, further than Qeshm Island, further than the naval map. It reaches your petrol station, your energy bill, your mortgage, your supermarket basket, your central bank. And that is the part most people still do not understand. If this kind of analysis is what you have been looking for, hit subscribe. I publish one of these briefings every single day. It takes seconds. Now watch the contradiction. The public language says talks continue. The military language says the ceasefire is being tested. Washington says Iran must reopen Hormuz before anything serious can move forward. Tehran says American strikes and regional pressure prove the other side cannot be trusted. One side talks about diplomacy. The other side talks about resistance. Both sides talk about peace. Both sides keep firing. That contradiction is not confusion. It is the system. And once you understand that system, the whole story becomes easier to read. Here is the part every outlet missed. The strikes are not happening despite the talks. The strikes are happening because of the talks. That is the uncomfortable part. When a deal is far away, each side postures. When a deal is impossible, each side escalates without restraint. But when a deal is close, every small point becomes expensive. Every concession becomes a battlefield. Every delay becomes leverage. Every missile becomes punctuation. That is what is happening now. Iran is not simply lashing out. It is testing the price of the deal. It is asking a brutal question. How much pain can I create before Washington decides that a partial settlement is cheaper than escalation? And Washington is asking its own question. How much force can I use before Tehran decides that reopening Hormuz is cheaper than absorbing another strike? That is not diplomacy as people imagine it. No quiet rooms. No perfect table. No clean handshake. This is diplomacy with drones in the air. It is bargaining with air defense systems active. It is ceasefire language over a battlefield. Every channel covering the U.S.-Iran war is framing last night as a ceasefire crisis. That is too small. This is a negotiating move. It is escalation as leverage. It is a warning written in damage. The United States did not choose Qeshm Island by accident. Iran did not choose Kuwait by accident. Qeshm is connected to Hormuz. Kuwait is connected to America's regional posture. Both targets speak. One speaks to the oil route. The other speaks to the alliance network. And the world is now being asked to pretend that talks can continue normally while both messages are still burning. The energy market is not pretending. The International Energy Agency's May report described an unprecedented supply shock. Cumulative losses from Gulf producers have exceeded 1 billion barrels. More than 14 million barrels per day of oil production has been shut in. That number is almost too large to feel. So reduce it. 14 million barrels per day is not a local disruption. It is not a temporary tanker delay. It is a wound in the global energy system. It means refineries worry about physical supply. It means traders price political risk into every barrel. It means airlines, shipping firms, factories, supermarkets, and families eventually absorb the cost. Oil can fall on one optimistic headline, then jump on one drone strike, then fall again on one diplomatic rumor. That is not stability. That is a market being held hostage by uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what Iran wants to manufacture. Because uncertainty forces urgency. Urgency forces compromises. And compromise is the only battlefield where a weaker military power can start to balance a stronger one. Wait, stop. Before I go further, you need to understand what Iran just did. And what it did is not what you think. Iran did not simply attack. Iran converted the ceasefire into a battlefield. That sounds strange, so let me explain it clearly. Most people think a ceasefire is the opposite of war. It is not. A ceasefire is only a pause in certain kinds of violence. It does not stop coercion. It does not stop pressure. It does not stop threats. It does not stop positioning. It does not stop each side trying to shape the political outcome. A ceasefire can be used as a bridge to peace, or it can be used as a weapon. Iran is using it as a weapon. It is keeping the language of talks alive while showing that the cost of delay rises every day. It is telling Washington, you want a deal. Fine, but you will pay for every hour. You will pay through oil. You will pay through Gulf security. You will pay through allies. You will pay through public pressure. And you will pay through the risk that this entire region becomes uninsurable. There is one move left on this board that nobody has made yet. Whoever makes it first ends this or explodes it. I will tell you exactly what it is before this briefing is done. But before I name that move, you need the historical pattern, because this has happened before. Not in the Gulf, not with oil, not with Hormuz, but with the same logic. In Korea, in July 1951, both sides began armistice talks. People often remember the Korean War as a 3-year war that ended with an armistice. That is true, but it hides the most important lesson. The talks began in 1951. The armistice was not signed until July 27, 1953. For 2 years, they talked and fought at the same time. Britannica describes the period directly. From the time liaison officers met in July 1951 until the armistice in July 1953, the war continued. That phrase matters. The war continued. Not before the talks, during the talks. That is the pattern. Talking and fighting, negotiating while killing, offering peace while improving position, using limited violence to shape the final line. The front stopped moving dramatically, but the killing did not stop. The negotiations did not remove the battlefield. They reorganized it. That is what Iran appears to be studying now. Not because Iran is North Korea, not because the situations are identical. They are not. But because the logic is similar. A militarily weaker side absorbs damage. It refuses to collapse. It turns survival into leverage. It understands that the stronger power wants a clean ending. Then it makes the clean ending expensive. That is the pattern. The weaker side says, yes, we will talk, but we will not talk as defeated people. We will talk while proving we can still hurt you. That is what Iran just did. It proved it can still hurt the regional system. Not enough to defeat America, enough to make the cost of American patience rise. And sometimes that is all a weaker power needs. This is why the Korean comparison matters. The most intense political bargaining often begins after both sides realize total victory is too expensive. That is when the war becomes stranger, less dramatic in some places, more dangerous in others, because the goal changes. You are no longer trying to win everything. You are trying to shape the ending, where the line is drawn, which sanctions remain, which routes reopen, which weapons are inspected, which guarantees are given, which side gets to call the outcome of victory. That is the battle now, and the Iran nuclear program is part of that battle, not as a separate issue, as the price tag. Washington wants limitations. Iran wants survival, sanctions relief, and recognition that it cannot be bombed into silence. Every strike changes that negotiation. Every strike tells the other side where the pain threshold is. Every strike reveals what each side cares about most. If Washington hits Qeshm, it tells Tehran that Hormuz pressure is central. If Iran hits Kuwait, it tells Washington that Gulf allies are part of the cost. This is not chaos. It is signaling. Brutal signaling, but signaling. And that is why the next 72 hours are so dangerous. When both sides are signaling with force, one mistake can become policy. One missed interception can become retaliation. One civilian death can become escalation. One damaged tanker can become a blockade. One blockade can become a regional war. This is how controlled escalation becomes uncontrolled escalation. Not because anyone planned disaster, because everyone believed they could manage pressure. The last time a militarily weaker power used this exact tactic against the United States, the result was not immediate peace. It was a long, grinding negotiation under fire. That is the warning. Korea had no Strait of Hormuz. Iran does. That is the difference that makes this more dangerous. In Korea, the battlefield mattered strategically. In the Gulf, the battlefield also prices the global economy. A ridge in Korea could shift a line on a map. Hormuz can shift inflation, energy bills, shipping insurance, central bank decisions, and domestic politics across continents. That is why an Iran deal will be expensive if it comes. Not because Iran is stronger than America. It is not. But because Iran holds a choke point the world cannot ignore. A choke point gives a weaker power something it otherwise lacks. Leverage. And leverage is not the same as strength. Leverage means you can make your opponent's victory costly. Leverage means you can turn a narrow tactical weakness into a broad strategic pressure point. Leverage means you can lose battles and still shape the negotiation. That is what Tehran is trying to do, and it is why Washington has to be very careful. Too little force, and Iran learns that violence works. Too much force, and the ceasefire dies in public. The space between those two mistakes is now very narrow. That is where the next 72 hours sit, inside that narrow space. The House of Commons Library has already noted the obvious European problem. Britain and the European Union want a long-term agreement. Of course they do. They want the oil route open. They want energy prices down. They want inflation contained. They want the Bank of England to have room to cut. They want shipping to normalize. They want the conflict contained. But wanting is not leverage. Europe wants the outcome. Washington and Tehran control the table. That is the humiliation nobody says out loud. Europe pays the price but does not control the switch. Britain can welcome talks. The EU can call for restraint. Foreign ministers can issue careful statements. But the route through Hormuz is not reopened by European language. It is reopened by Iranian calculation and American pressure. That is a very uncomfortable position for Europe. Full exposure, limited influence, maximum consequence, minimum control. And that is where this stops being foreign policy and becomes personal. Let me stop the analysis for a moment and speak to you directly as someone who pays energy bills, fills a tank, or has a mortgage in the UK. That number I told you to hold £500. That is what this ceasefire being weaponized costs you personally every year if it fails. £500 is not an abstract forecast. It is what sustained oil and gas pressure can do to typical annual UK energy bills. That is before you count the petrol pump, before you count food transport, before you count business energy costs, before you count interest rates staying higher for longer, before you count the mortgage renewal that suddenly becomes uglier because inflation refuses to fall. This is how a drone strike in Kuwait enters a home in Britain. Not immediately, not with smoke, with pricing, with delay, with pass-through, with a bill that arrives months later and looks domestic even though its origin was geopolitical. First comes the strike, then comes the oil movement, then comes the gas forecast, then comes the inflation risk, then comes the Bank of England problem, then comes the household. The household is always last in the chain, but it is where the chain is felt. Petrol prices respond faster. Energy bills respond slower. Mortgage rates respond through expectations. And expectations are exactly what this crisis damages. If oil prices stay high, inflation becomes harder to control. If inflation becomes harder to control, rate cuts become harder to justify. If rate cuts become harder to justify, households waiting for mortgage relief wait longer. If the war worsens, rate hikes move from unthinkable to discussable. That is why this matters even if you do not care about Iran. That is why this matters even if you never follow Gulf politics. That is why this matters even if you think foreign policy is something that happens somewhere else. It does not stay somewhere else. It travels through oil prices, it travels through gas markets, it travels through shipping insurance, it travels through food logistics, it travels through monetary policy, and eventually it reaches your bank account. The cruel part is that the public is trained to watch the wrong thing. They watch the headline. Ceasefire holds. Talks continue. Oil falls. Market relief. But the real question is not whether the headline sounds calm. The real question is whether the system beneath it is stabilizing. Are tankers moving normally? Are insurers pricing the route normally? Are Gulf states confident? Are U.S. forces reducing posture? Is Iran lowering operational pressure? Are negotiators clarifying terms? Are oil prices staying down without needing constant reassurance? If the answer is no, the ceasefire is not peace. It is a pause with a fuse. And if the ceasefire is being weaponized, then every household is exposed to a political game it cannot vote on, cannot influence, and cannot escape. That is the part that should make people angry, not emotional. Clear, because you are not only watching war risk, you are underwriting it. Every time the route shakes, you pay. Every time the market reprices, you pay. Every time policymakers delay rate cuts because energy inflation refuses to behave, you pay. The conflict becomes a tax, not voted through parliament, not announced in a budget. A geopolitical tax, paid through pumps, meters, loans, and prices. That is why the next 72 hours matter for ordinary people. If Iran offers a controlled step back, markets get a reason to breathe. If Washington accepts it, the ceasefire gains another layer. If both sides overplay the moment, oil rises again. And if Hormuz remains uncertain, the household cost becomes harder to avoid. So watch two numbers, oil and the October energy price cap. One tells you what the market fears. The other tells you what the fear costs you. Now we come to the prediction. The move I told you to watch for here is exactly what it looks like and when it happens. Iran will not fully reopen everything at once. That would waste leverage. Iran will not publicly surrender the Hormuz card. That would damage its own narrative. And the United States will not publicly give sanctions relief just for reopening the route. That would look like weakness. So the move has to be something both sides can sell. A partial civilian shipping corridor. That is the move. Not a full reopening, not a final settlement, not a grand peace. A narrow corridor for civilian and commercial traffic, framed as a humanitarian and economic de-escalation measure. Iran can say it acted responsibly. The United States can say pressure worked. Markets can treat it as progress. Europe can welcome it. Gulf states can exhale. And both sides can continue negotiating without admitting the ceasefire nearly failed. That is why I expect the next move to look technical, not dramatic. A corridor, a monitored route, a limited shipping guarantee, a temporary navigation arrangement, a pause in attacks on civilian vessels, a statement about protecting commercial traffic. That is the language to watch, not peace, not victory. Traffic, navigation, civilian routes, humanitarian shipping, commercial passage. Those are the words that will tell you the deal is being rescued. My call is this. Within 72 hours, by Saturday, June 6th, Iran offers a partial Hormuz gesture, not a full reopening, a token civilian shipping corridor. The United States accepts it, calls it progress, and extends the ceasefire frame. The Iran war then enters another phase of brinkmanship rather than resolution. I am on record. And there is a second signal. Watch oil on Friday. If oil drops sharply below the danger range, the corridor offer has either been made quietly or is imminent. If oil stays elevated and keeps rising into the weekend, the 72-hour window has closed. And if that happens, we are entering a more dangerous phase. Because then the market will understand that neither side has found the face-saving off-ramp. That is when accidental escalation becomes more likely. That is when Gulf states begin acting more nervously. That is when insurers increase pressure. That is when shipping companies reroute or delay. That is when domestic politics starts pressing leaders toward harder positions. And that is when a ceasefire can become a trap. Not because the sides want full war, but because neither side can step back without looking like it lost. That is the most dangerous kind of crisis. A crisis where both sides need a ladder, but both are afraid to be seen climbing down first. The partial corridor is that ladder, small enough to deny, useful enough to matter, technical enough to avoid humiliation. If Iran offers it, the conflict cools without ending. If Washington accepts it, the White House gets a headline. If the market believes it, oil breathes. If the market does not believe it, the war premium stays. That is the next 72 hours, not peace or war in a simple sense. A test of whether the latter exists. Save this video, come back on Sunday, tell me in the comments if I was right or where I got it wrong. Either way, you will have the context nobody else gave you. Now let me pull the camera back, because the deeper pattern is bigger than Iran, bigger than Kuwait, bigger than Qeshm, bigger than one ceasefire. The deeper pattern is this: modern wars no longer end cleanly. They mutate. They move from battlefield to negotiation, from negotiation to sanctions, from sanctions to shipping, from shipping to energy prices, from energy prices to elections, from elections back to war policy. The public keeps waiting for endings. States keep creating phases. That is why this feels so confusing. One day there is a ceasefire. The next day there are drones. One day there are talks. The next day there are strikes. One day oil falls. The next day it jumps. The public asks, is the war ending or restarting? The answer is yes. It is doing both. It is ending in one form and restarting in another. That is what weaponized ceasefires do. They create the appearance of restraint while preserving the tools of pressure. They let leaders say, talks continue. They let militaries keep options open. They let markets hope. They let diplomats buy time. But they also let every actor test boundaries. How much can Iran strike without ending talks? How much can America hit without collapsing the process? How much can Gulf states absorb before demanding a wider response? How much can oil markets tolerate before the economic damage becomes political? Those are the questions now, and none of them are comfortable. Drop your prediction in the comments right now. Where does the oil price land on Friday? Is the deal made by Sunday? Does Iran offer the partial corridor? I read every single comment, and in the next briefing, I will call out whoever got it right. Because this is exactly the kind of moment where the public record matters. Not vibes, not slogans, not emotional shouting. A clear prediction, a clear timeline, a clear test. If you want to understand the deeper pattern behind why this war keeps almost ending but never does, my next briefing connects directly to what I just showed you. Watch it after this. It answers the question this video raises. Because the most dangerous wars are not always the ones where nobody talks. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are the ones where everyone keeps talking while the battlefield quietly expands. That is the lesson from Korea. That is the warning from Hormuz. That is the meaning of Kuwait. And that is why Qeshm Island matters. The ceasefire is no longer a line between war and peace. It is the space where both sides are fighting over the terms of the next phase. Remember that, because the next headline will probably sound calmer than the reality. It will say talks continue. It will say both sides remain committed. It will say markets are watching. It will say leaders urge restraint. But beneath that language, the real question will remain. Who is using the ceasefire better? Iran to extract concessions, or America to force a controlled reopening? That is the board. And the next 72 hours will show us who is moving first. The ceasefire was never the peace. It was always the next phase of the war.